Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. I'm sorry to disturb everybody. There's a white BMW Wisconsin license plate 909 MTG parked right along the front of our building. Could you please move it? It is a traffic hazard. BMW white SUV 909 MTG. Thank you. I got it.
Yeah. Friends, before we begin, two notes in addition to the business with the BMW. First of all, I learned this morning that our chiller for the HVAC system here is not working today. So I encourage you to doff whatever piece of clothing you can take off and still stay within some degree of appropriateness, because I'm taking my jacket off, and it's going to get a little warm. It already is a little warm. The second thing is, if you have your phones with you, if you could just make sure they're on, vibrate or silent or whatever. Thank you. The story is told of a group of people wandering in the desert who come upon an oasis. They rest beneath a fruit tree, drink cool water from the stream next to it, and eat of the tree's delicious fruit. When it's time to leave, they wonder how to repay the many gifts the oasis has given them. They take some of the water from the stream into their canteens, some soil around the tree, which they put in their backpacks, and they even take some seeds from the tree's fruit. As they continue on their journey, they pause now and then to take out some of that rich earth, plant some seeds, and water the planting so there will be new oases for other travelers. Gathering here this morning, we recognize the myriad ways Jimmy Ansfield, through his relationships, implanted within each of us seeds of love. As those seeds continue to bear fruit, we will be in the honored position to spread Jimmy's influence far and wide. Our coming together is an opportunity to share stories and reminiscences about Jimmy, but before we do, we're going to read some Psalms together. The earth, this is from Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, the world and all who dwell there. For God laid its foundations upon the sea and established it upon the currents. Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in God's holy place? Those with clean hands and pure hearts, who never speak with malice, who never swear deceitfully. They shall receive blessings from the Lord, justice from God their helper. Such are the people who turn to you, who seek your presence, O God of Jacob. From Psalm 23, please join me if you know it. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for the sake of his name. Even when I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for you are with me. With rod and staff you comfort me. You have set a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And from the biblical book Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, there is a time for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what has been planted, a time to destroy and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to wail and a time for dancing, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time for refraining from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time for keeping and a time to discard, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time for silence and a time to speak. The words don't come easily at these moments. We do have some members of family who will be speaking to us, and I believe we're beginning with Tom. Oh no, bench? I'm thinking of a number between 3 and 5. Let's do Tom and then bench and then Jonathan. That's it.
I don't know what to say except that Jimmy is Jimmy. When we were growing up, our parents were avid readers of books and newspapers. They could be caught sometimes reading their favorite columnists, like Damon Runyon. It's impossible to duplicate his writing skills, his choice of words, his choice of sentences. But they're always about characters, the guys and dolls, characters haunting that 1 mile strip of Broadway that became so famous. Famous characters like Dave the Dude, sorry, Rabbi, Sam the Gonif, Harry the Horse, Queenie Martin. Now, you'll note that the absence of a character called Jimmy Blue. There's obviously a reason for that. He wasn't on Broadway, but he sure was a character. I think we all knew that somehow, my brother and I see the same expression on Bench and Jonathan's faces. Jimmy would say something and my brother would go, and I would go. But for eternity, Jimmy will be the absolute antithesis of a Damon Runyon kind of character. The family has been trying to understand that for years. It wasn't like this so much as a kid, but he was born September 15th, 1941. An important day, but that was 8 weeks before the day of infamy. But that became important. That's the third child, so his dad, our beloved Maury, was a physician, and with 3 kids that probably delayed when he was going to have to go into active duty. But our roots were Milwaukee, and our heritage was the Ansfield and the Katz family. Both Maury, the letter J was added later. All the Ansfield boys didn't have last names. There were 5 boys and 1 girl. One mother died and another mother came along for the last 3 boys. But when the kids went to college, they all took that middle name, J for Joseph, my grandfather, Jimmy's grandfather, except for occasional Joe that pops up in the family as a first name. That comes later, but that's kind of the pattern for our family. Both Maury Ansfield and Esther Harriet Katz were born in Milwaukee. Their parents and relatives moved. I think it was called a pogrom, but they moved to Milwaukee in the early 1900s, or maybe right before that, somewhere in that time frame. And two of the boys were born here, I found out today. One was brought as a baby here. And then there was the three older children. You know, it's important to understand that when kids came here, some people could be brothers, but they came from different countries or had different last names. Because if you knew what it was like in Tsar's Russia, it was only the firstborn who was protected against being conscripted into the army. So the names of other children were gifted out to other homes with daughters or to different countries. So kind of the founder of my family's information was Aunt B, and Aunt B said that some of the family was from Austria, and some was from Ukraine, and some was from other parts of that part of the world. Maury and Esther were classmates here in Milwaukee, born here. They went to the famous 4th Street School. My mother was valedictorian of her grade school class, and those two were already close. My dad was not jealous at all. He was proud that she was number one. 10 years after, another famous Milwaukeean, Golda Meir, was valedictorian of the same class. So our history goes back many, many years. Dad, brilliant doctor, highly respected. We kind of knew something was special about him, as busy as he was. But he was top of his class and decided to start right here in Milwaukee until he was called away to active duty in World War II. So the Ansfield boys, there were 3 of us, as different as can be imagined. Don, or DJ, was the oldest. He was incredibly smart, very different. He was blonde and blue-eyed and curly hair. Don was adopted. And he was as close to Jimmy and to me as I think any two people could be. I was always kind of brought along as a tag-along. Jimmy frequently was not in the early days, but he kind of grew into the family, especially as we got older. Don had us absolutely convinced that he was the chosen one. He was adopted. He told us, and we absolutely believed him, that the parents chose him and they had to take us by law. And we were convinced for a long time that that was absolutely true. He was very athletic, very funny, very popular. So that's DJ. And I'm TJ again. Here comes the Joseph in the name. Classic middle child, kind of nervous, focused, ambitious. In our preteen years, both Maury and Esther made sure we learned one thing. When you sit down and talk to a person, listen first. Don't walk in the office and say, if you're going to be a doctor, which was assumed you would become a doctor if you're in that family. You don't say, what's wrong with your thumb today? You say, tell me about yourself. You can learn a lot about people that way. Jimmy, or JJ, plump, a little clumsy, smart, listened a lot. Listened a lot. It was much easier for him to just naturally learn how to listen to people. He had one thing that always seemed to attract him, and it was food, particularly chocolate, and I'm sure we're going to hear about that today. But we knew that Jimmy was different, and he provided us with a life full of compassion. I've never seen anything like it. Maury and Esther loved life and had everything going for them, at least for a while. We came back in 1945. We moved into Maryland Avenue. It was just a perfect area close to State Teachers College where we went to grade school. Temple Emmanuel was a few blocks away. As importantly, Plotkin's Delicatessen was just a few blocks away. So it was a great place to grow up until we later moved to Whitefish Bay. When he came back from service, and it was important to understand that he was an academician and he was assistant health commissioner of Milwaukee, so he would dash out and see a lot of polio cases during the terrible epidemics, so reminiscent of what we've all gone through for the last few years, but children were paralyzed and in iron lungs. So it was lovely that they bought the first house, a cottage on Beaver Lake in Heartland, Wisconsin. It was a wonderful place to grow up, swimming. It was perfect. Dad and Mom bought a home on Lake Drive. It seemed perfect. But then we started noticing a few changes. Dad was tired and didn't seem to be listening. It was hard enough with those, I think, 16 or 17-hour days that he had anyway. But he came back home, and one day Jimmy was 12 and I was 13, and Don, I think had just turned 16, said, I'm going through some tests. I'm not sure what's going on. But we found out just a few months later that he was not going to be with us long, and he wasn't. So that was a very hard lesson for 3 young boys and a mother who was at home with them. Life went on. We looked to Mom. She was a great counselor, a great mentor for us. Anxious, nervous, a Budinsky to the 4th power, seemed to know everything we were doing way before we did. Irritating to a lot of people in our lives, and it was not unusual, for instance, that a person riding on the bus next to Mother, when we got to see the person just happened, I sat next to a woman who said that she has the same last name. If I remember, she knew everything except the exact amount I was earning that year. I think that was kind of a common feature with Esther. And it was something that we had to live with for a lifetime. We all went our separate ways, really back when we were 14 or 15. We had similar things in common. Jimmy and I were very active in B'nai B'rith Youth Organization. And we have many friends to this day, and it's where I met my wife. 61, almost 62 years of marriage, and it was very important in our world. But Jimmy also had great friends, and he had a mentor at school, a teacher by the name of Harold Eichen. I met his sister, wife, today, and it was a remarkable situation because Sonny ran a camp in northern Wisconsin, Camp Timberlane, and I think that there probably are some of his patients who were campers. Jimmy was a senior, a counselor, and I know helped with that camp, but that's where the mensch really developed. That very special person that Jimmy was. He was a master listener, a master friend. I think we should all feel blessed by watching him and Joni these last few years. From 9/9/2000, 1999, 23 years ago almost, or 24. These two have been an image of love and companionship and caring and sharing. And with his family and all the Strauss kids, it's been a remarkable, remarkable experience. He taught us how to live. He taught us how to talk. He taught us how to listen. As long as you didn't spend too much attention to some of his antics, or maybe you enjoyed it, we did. He is our friend, and we love you all.
Tom mentioned Jimmy Blue. Well, long before he went by that name, Jimmy Blue, I knew him as James in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. My first memory of my dad is seeing him reading the Sunday paper, the Prince Valiant comic, draped in this bright or blinding, multicolored bathrobe. It was covered in these splashes of greens and oranges and reds. His color palette was more eclectic back then, but the effect he had on you was the same. He brought soul and radiance into every room that he entered, and not only because of his daring sartorial choices. Here was a man who used to do his rounds at St. Michael's Hospital on rollerblades, who managed to make colonoscopies into semi-festive affairs. I saw my first one live when I was 6 years old. Even the fabulous girl group, the Shirelles, recognized his star power during the 1989 JCC Gala, bringing him up on stage when they appreciated his dance moves. They then asked him to go back to the dance floor after they heard him sing. His joie de vivre was palpable, it was defining, and it was pretty apt for the son of a cerebral and austere existentialist, his mother, Esther. There was no end to our dad's love of life and its pleasures. In his last weeks, he'd repeat, "I want to live," over and over, a prayer that I've seen in his eyes for as long as I've known him. It's hard to describe the experience of growing up with a father who was never a big believer in the dictates of adulthood. The loss of his father, Maury, as Tom discussed, when he was 12, was an event that turned his world upside down. And it was as though he was trying to preserve some piece of his dad by Peter Panning his way through life, never losing his playfulness, never losing his childlike buoyancy. When new friends of mine would ask me about him, I'd usually describe him as Milwaukee's Patch Adams before playing them some of his operatic voicemails, which were mostly just him singing me show tunes and reciting psalms. I considered playing some of them here, actually, but thought they might be more appropriate for the Shiva crowd. My dad was most himself when he was putting a smile on someone else's face, and often that face was mine or Jonathan's or Joni's. The gifts he gave me and us were too many to name, but the one that I feel every day was his unwavering, unconditional, and uncomplicated love. He showered me with "I love you" so often that had I been one of his beloved orchid plants, I would have drowned within a week. Unlike many fathers of his pre-boomer generation, he never left me guessing where I dwell in his heart. He used to call me his love child. This is an odd phrasing. There are a lot of such Jimmy-isms, but just try to imagine the blessing of being born into that role. I didn't always appreciate it. When I was 6 or 7, I suddenly became aware of how different he seemed from the friends, my dad's friends. He was looser and goofier. He wore these fluorescent button-ups. They wore t-shirts. Those dads threw footballs. I prayed my dad didn't throw anything at all. One day when he was taking a new friend of mine and me to the museum, I asked him to just tone it down a little bit, act normal. My mom coolly instructed me that I had nothing to be ashamed of, that I shouldn't try to change him. What made him different was his magic, his luminosity, and that was the very thing that I loved about him. It's not to say that he was resistant to change or to self-reinvention. I remember one dinner that we shared when I was in college. Apropos of nothing, he asked me how he could be a better father. We hadn't been fighting. We weren't in a tough spot. He just wanted to do better. In a way, I think he was always trying to be the father that he had lost as a 12-year-old. The world mostly knew him for his Kodachrome glow, but behind that sunny disposition and those rosy cheeks was a sensitive, sentimental soul. His appreciation for life's pleasures came from his intimate knowledge of its wreckage. Jimmy Blue, after all, originated in what he called his blue period during his second divorce. From that sadness, he forged a new self that blossomed during his marriage to Joni. The older he got, the younger he seemed. I know most of us can testify to that. How else can the death of an 81-year-old man hit us like such a tragedy? It's because he squeezed every ounce of life out of those 8 decades, and in doing so, he made all of our lives more radiant.
Tough acts to follow. As an aside, I went to print this out early this morning on my dad's printer. His office upstairs, and the black cartridge of ink was out, so we only had color, so it came out blue. honest, there was no black ink. So I'm reading this in blue, so I'm not sure how that'll go. For the past couple months, I think like probably all the rest of you, I've been struggling to wrap my head around what happened to my dad. And I never got a proper chance really to speak to him about it because he was already too sick and in rapid decline. So this is a letter that I wrote to him in place of the conversation we never had. Dad, I began to hash out this note in my head when I got home, as you languished in hospice in your big, gleaming bedroom. I called it your brightness retreat, as opposed to Aaron Rodgers and his darkness retreat. As the Packers quarterback descended into darkness to mull his future, here we were, so fittingly for you, enveloped in light. Whenever we'd catch up by phone, you'd go out of your way first to run through all the latest sports scores and highlights from our hometown teams. I think you figured I couldn't access sports news in China. I could, and I did, but I still treasured your updates, even if I'd heard it all before, just the effort you made to connect with me. And your delivery was so adorable. So now here I was, updating you. Alas, by this point, you couldn't even use your phone anymore, or follow the news, let alone the Rodgers saga. But when I asked you about it on a couple occasions, you were adamant in saying it was time to move on. And it was only natural that you felt this way. since you yourself had long since mastered the art of moving on, of taking your lumps in life and forging onward to something new. This was key to the charmed life you led despite all the setbacks. You preached acceptance and coped best you could with what came your way. And you could tell when the time had come to move on. That said, you seemed anything but ready to accept that your time had come. None of us were. Your brutal condition unfolded far too fast. It was all too raw for us to reckon with. I want to live, I want to live. Yeah, you kept bellowing that tear-jerking line. So that's who you were. Your feelings were irrepressible. Your energy was inexhaustible. Your spirit and optimism were unshakable. You still had so much to share, so many good things and loved ones to live for. And I think as Bench and Tom have noted, your will to live was really a lifetime in the making. That became clearer to me when I cracked open perhaps your most cherished book, Tuesdays with Maury. 20 plus years ago, you'd bought copies for me and others you love. But now I gave it a closer read, and I found that familiar refrain, I want to live. So I began to ponder the many ways that this bestseller about the dying professor, Maury Schwartz, and his lessons on living might have resonated with you. For one, obviously, you had your own Maury, the father and doctor you worshipped. He was 45, and you were only 12 when he died of a lymphoma. In his final weeks, you and your brother Tom were not allowed to visit and see him writhing in pain. And that only compounded your sense of emptiness and loss. Then there was your own early brush with death. In 1974, when I was just a few months old. You were your own best doctor. You helped make sure that your pituitary tumor was detected early on and successfully removed. But then came a giant blast of radiation to top it all off. As I grew up, you often alluded to these early life traumas, how they helped shape you and fuel you, but haunted you as well. They haunted me too. When I was 12, it so happened you turned 45, the same ages that you and Grandpa Maury had shared. That year was 1986. And I recall feeling so lucky that it passed without incident. To the contrary, that was the year that Ben was born. When you learn how to die, you learn how to live. As Maury Schwartz keeps telling us in the book, that's his quintessential line, and it's been your mantra too, Dad, your carpe diem. 6 weeks ago, sitting there in your brightness retreat, Bench and I would read you passages from the book by your bedside. You could barely string together a sentence by then. But once you managed to finish mine, learn how to die, and you learn how to live, you said, perking up those eyebrows of yours. And live you have, to the fullest, as everyone says. It's hard to sum up your exploits because you provided us with so much classic material. Your father, people always say, shaking their heads with some incredulous look. I've heard it hundreds of times. I've even heard it in Chinese, ni baba. And then come the stories of your stunts and snafus, your excessive workouts and sugar binges, your non sequiturs, and your joyous outbursts of song. You're not only a character, you're many characters. From G.I. Jim, your custom plate on a car that many drivers around here knew to steer clear of, to Cuddling Bear, the tribal name you took one year when we were in Indian Guides, to my horror, Cuddling Bear. From Bubble Doc, after the weight loss procedure you did in the 80s, to Dr. Absfield, your nickname at the gym more recently. From Blue Man in and around Mequon to El Hombre Azul down in Puerto Vallarta. You're a crazy study in contrast, Dad. So loony one minute, so locked in the next, always full of love. And that's what made you such a unique species. You're the heart of yours, the caring doctor, the mushy father. For all the moments of embarrassment at your expense that I felt as a child, they were easily offset. by the utter kick I've gotten out of you since. Jonathan, you'd ask me, rhetorically, would you say that your father is one of a kind? Duh. Yeah. You were not shy about posing more serious questions on life either, even if your timing wasn't always great. You were up for talking about anything, even if you weren't always listening. You gave unfiltered opinions, but always kept an open mind. You seemed to have a funny pet name for everyone in your life. And you called me Switzerland, because I never took sides in your marital disagreements. And you called me Still Waters Run Deep, because I could be so reserved. Such was your special power for reaching people and making them feel special too. As Amy and I tried to have kids for years, you'd tell me you were praying for a, quote, miracle on 34th Street. And you kept adjusting the street name upward based on my age. Until finally a miracle on 43rd Street happened when I was 43 and we had Mira. Turn on the faucet, as your favorite book puts it. Wash yourself with the emotion. It won't hurt you, it will only help. That was Maury's approach to life in the book, and it clearly was yours too, even toward the end, in your brightness retreat, when the emotion and the sheer will to live was about all that you could express. Only by letting it all out, you knew, could you find inner peace. So in the end, I tend to think a lifetime full of faith and reflection left you amply prepared. In that sense, you were ready. Of course, we're not ready. Not at all. But we have been consoled by the massive outpouring of good vibes for Jimmy Blue. And at least I could bring some of that love back home to you in recent weeks. From Mark, the deli guy at Sendik's, from Anna, the baker at Mila's, from all the nurses at Dr. Sinaitis' office, and all the staff at Club Regina on the beach. You knew you had all the care and support anyone could ask for, from dear Joni and the whole Strauss family, plus all your previous families, and your all-star lineup of caregivers. You barely had much time in the end, but like Maury, you gave us every minute that you had. You gave all the love you could and ultimately got it all back. So thank you, Dad. I'm signing off the way we always did since our time together in Indian Guides. Pals forever, son. Pals forever, Dad.
It may be because of our people's desert origins, but there's a lot of stories about people out in the desert and finding an oasis. I mentioned one earlier. Another one just came to mind as Bench and Jonathan were speaking, and that is sort of starts the same way. People find they're out walking, they find this beautiful oasis with a tree and a stream and everything else, and is about to leave, one of the people thinks, you know, how can I bless you to the tree? You've already got beautiful fruit. You already have this beautiful stream. You're tall, you're strong. Finally concluded, what I can bless you with is I hope that all of your children turn out like you. And I'm sure this is not news to anyone, but when you stand in front of a family that have so many extraordinary people in it, who are so good at their core, that doesn't happen by accident. Doesn't happen all the time, mind you, but when it does happen, it doesn't happen by chance. And it's really testament to Jimmy's influence on us all. Jim was not born as a doctor or a rabbi or a food author But he did have the acumen to do any one of the three, and in some measure accomplished all three, at least avocationally, if not vocationally. Professionally became a doctor, like his dad, also an internist and focusing on the GI tract. His dad became his model in many respects, yet Jimmy would have made a terrific rabbi. And if you ever heard him wax poetic about good food, you know he would have excelled in that arena as well. When Jim's father died, his good friend, Rabbi Herb Friedman, eulogized him as the paradigmatic good man, kind, gentle, sensitive, refined, who went far beyond the Hippocratic oath to help his patients pastorally as a counselor. It was Jim's heartfelt desire to become a good man like his dad, to be good in an exemplary way. As Rabbi Friedman wrote in a cantata dedicated to Maury, quote, "The Lord will teach him right from wrong, his life will resound with joy and song. He will read and write and invent a way to love his neighbor and bring peace every day." Jimmy did become a good man like his dad. He had overflowing reservoirs of the quality that we call in Hebrew chesed, or loving kindness. And he embodied the Jewish value of sever panim yafot, facing other people cheerfully and with a good countenance. A moving description of Jimmy was penned by his cousin Carol Wigner in an email to Jim's children. "Your dad had a light that glowed wherever he went. He could not go to any public space without running into people he knew. Everyone he saw was delighted to see him, and your dad returned the warmth in triplicate. A born caretaker, he became a beloved doctor, just like his dad." Professionally, Jimmy experienced the great tsunami of change in the practice of medicine over the past decades that put less value on some of Jim's greatest gifts, the ability to form deep and meaningful connections with his patients. This became increasingly more difficult to do as physicians had to prioritize the number of patients they could see in an hour over the quality and healing power of those interactions. When Jim retired in 2011, medicine was a very different field of endeavor than it once had been for Jim, his brother Tom, and their father Maury. Jim's forays into love and family led him to join his life with Joni's. Now, to be fair, there's a little bit more of a backstory. Timmy Strauss, destined eventually to become one of Jimmy's stepchildren, played an integral role in bringing Joni and Jim together. His wife Danielle had an appointment with Jimmy, her doctor. Not long thereafter, Timmy actually paged Jimmy one evening and suggested that Jim ask his mother out. Jimmy did, and the connection was immediate and powerful. Their first date was a 3-hour conversation on the phone, followed by an Italian dinner in Port Washington. A year later, I had the honor and good fortune to preside at their wedding, outside on the lawn in front of the Lake Park Bistro. I was struck by Jim's youthful exuberance and his talent for connection. It is a rare occasion when a couple in their 50s throw off as much heat and light as a younger bride and groom. There was something magical about the two of them together, a combination more powerful than the sum of its parts. When Jim, I can't even say this with a straight face, when Jim asked Joni to marry him, he had dressed up as an Easter bunny and proposed in that manner. Joni said, "No, no, no. I am not agreeing to anything when I have no idea who is in that suit." Jimmy placed a tremendous emphasis on the Jewish value of shalom bayit, which means peace in the home. He would offer a prayer every night before bed, expressing gratitude for Joni's love and that of their combined families, as well as prayers for friends and relatives dealing with illness and other life difficulties. He would include the words, "I love you, my darling, I love you for keeps." There among the 30 stuffed animals on the bed, Jim would regale Joni with songs, prayers, poetry, readings from the Bible, and more. His prayers were radically inclusive, including, from time to time, a dog. Joni and Jimmy were not given to arguing. But they had one deep, deep disagreement regarding the importance of showing up to places on time. If you know whose position was which. More representative of their relationship was their home answering machine, back when we had home answering machines, whose outgoing message contained both of their voices alternating every other word. I don't want to paint a whitewashed picture of Jimmy. He had his foibles, as we all do. He encountered challenges in his own health, as well as some challenging areas of relationships, all of which he tried to learn from and find the positive, even when in pain. His granddaughters, Riley and Chandler, summed up what Jimmy was really all about. They called Jimmy the mensch of mensches, the good guy of good guys, and said they didn't know anyone who loved another person as much as Jimmy loved Joni. Grandson Justin agreed that Jimmy was a healer who shared his heart with everyone he met. They observed that Jim had a heart of gold, and that whenever they saw the blue water of the lake or of the sky, they would think of Jim, as he had been nicknamed Jimmy Blue, evidently in several different languages. His grandson Cole wrote, "The world got a whole lot darker because you are gone. Thank you for making the world a better place. Sing with the birds, dance with the angels. I love you. Godspeed, rest in peace." Jimmy made close connections wherever he went. It was mentioned that they took to wintering in Puerto Vallarta and made friends among their neighbors, and made very good friends, in fact, some of whom were in contact with Jim once he fell ill. When they would head south for the winters, they would bring Packers merchandise as gifts. Some of those neighbors thought so highly of Jim that they asked him to be the godparent of their children. He shared with Justin an article from a Jewish newspaper, something about the Jewish National Fund or another like charity. He clarified for Justin that he sent the article not to fundraise, but to make a better world. Justin told me that Tikkun Olam, perfecting this often broken world, was a guiding principle for Jim. Stepdaughter Danielle told me Jimmy felt that by getting ill, he had broken his promise to Joni. He fought, she said, so hard for all of us. She smiled, recalling the range of antics associated with Jim. I got to watch something that I hope goes up online at some point, a video of Jimmy playing an unusually jovial Moses at a Seder where the grandkids were all very young, and most of whom were dressed in slaves, although Cole got to play Pharaoh. Whether it was a toga-wearing Pharaoh, or a doctor doing rounds at St. Michael's on rollerblades, or the candy-throwing character at the Whitefish Bay 4th of July parade, or taking his grandchildren out on what he called magical mystery tours, according to his grandkids, being around him as a youngster was like magic. And as they grew up, he maintained his interest in what each was up to, even taking the trouble to get to know his grandkids' boyfriends and girlfriends. As has been alluded to, personally, I really can't help but thinking Jimmy's strong connection to his, let's just say, inner child is in some measure tied to losing his father at 12. As occurs in many traumas, a part of us remains frozen at the age of occurrence. For Jim, this might have been the case. Yet what may have come out of personal tragedy became an important life message to others, to never lose touch with that inner child, and Jim never lost touch. At gatherings, he had no compunction against traveling or gravitating towards the children's table. Such was the soul of this charming, kind, and dashing gentleman. To all of Jimmy's relatives, you are his destiny. You carry his legacy, as we all do, into the future. You say Kaddish for him, and in fact, in Jewish tradition, teaches that you are his Kaddish, the unimpeachable testimony that his life was worthwhile, purposeful, and good. So what do we do now? Well, we continue to tell each other the stories about Jim and the way he touched our lives. Some of them will make us laugh. Some of them will make us cry. And we will undoubtedly, hopefully, cherish those memories. And even though Jim is gone, we can see to it that whenever we walk through a door, Jimmy walks through it with us. We can do that by learning and living the lessons Jimmy has taught us throughout his entire life. To be relentless in our commitment to try to see the cup as half full rather than half empty. To greet every person with the quality of sever panim yafot, greeting the world with a pleasant countenance. To maintain a connection to the enthusiasm and hopefulness of youth. To be willing to laugh at ourselves, whether by rollerblading, dressing like Moses, sitting at the children's table, etc. To love our children, to cherish our grandchildren, and to value our friends. And should we be blessed with a life partner, to build a partnership worthy of God's blessing. And to keep moving forward with hope towards the future, even when we suffer significant losses. If we do these things and continue to do them together in the months and years ahead, then Jim will be alive in us and will continue to bless the world with his presence. May we have the wisdom and the strength to do so. Jimmy, we pray that your soul rests in peace, and we hope that just as your memory blesses us, that we will, in our own lives, come to be a blessing to you. Amen. In a moment, we're going to conclude this portion of the funeral here at Sinai before we head to second home for the burial. Right now, we're going to intone, the cantor will chant El Malei Rachamim, literally means God full of mercy. And unlike the Kaddish, which we usually associate with death, the Kaddish doesn't talk about death at all, actually. It just talks about life, the gift of life and gratitude for life. The El Malei Rachamim that we're about to sing and read actually does talk directly about death and ask that God take care of Jimmy's soul and that his soul, quote unquote, will be bound up in the bond of eternal life. Please rise.
El Malei Rachamim shochen bamromim Hamtzeh menucha nechona tachat kanfei hashchina Im kedoshim utehorim kezohar harakia mazahirim et nishmat Pinchas Yosef ben Moshe ve'Esther שהלך לעולמו. בעל הרחמים יסתירהו בסתר כנפיו לעולמים. ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו. Adonai hu nachalato v'yanuach b'shalom al mishkavo v'nomar Amen.
O God, full of compassion, eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest under the wings of your presence to our loved one, Jimmy Ansfield, who has entered eternity. Master of mercy, let him find refuge forever in the shadow of your wings, and let his soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life. The eternal God is his inheritance. May he rest in peace. And let us all say together,
Amen.
Friends, services will continue at Second Home Cemetery. We will not be going in a funeral procession. Following burial, everyone is cordially invited back to the home of Jimmy and Joni, 10413 North Haddonstone Place in Mequon. We have maps to the cemetery and maps to the home located outside the sanctuary. To know Jimmy was to love him. Simple as that. At this time, we ask that everyone stand and remain standing until the casket has left the sanctuary. We invite the pallbearers forward.